Hello and welcome to the Lorekeeper's Librarium. Today we're exploring the lore of the two Lost Primarchs of the first founding legions. They were mysteriously and deliberately removed from all known Imperial records before the Horus Heresy. If you'd like to support the channel, there's a Patreon link in the description below, and you can also find us on Spotify if you want to listen to audio only. The lights flickered again, a soft stutter that had become a familiar sight to Aldrin Vorsh. After 3 years in this forgotten station, he had become used to the behavior of the place. The patterns of its failing systems had become a kind of companion, the only companion he had left. In the quiet of his makeshift study, Vorsh wrapped his thin fingers around a cup of recaf and enjoyed the warmth that began to chase away the chill of the orbiting station. The liquid was bitter, synthesized from concentrates that were older than his tenure here, but the feel of the cup in his hands was comforting. Small mercies, he had learned, were the only mercies a fugitive could expect. Through the window, Horus Prime hung like a grey pearl against the black velvet of space. The cemetery world, billions of the Emperor's faithful, lay beneath that stone skin, their graves stretching from pole to pole in endless rows that blurred together when seen from orbit. On quiet nights, and all nights were quiet here, Vorsh sometimes imagined he could hear them, all those countless dead, whispering their stories to anyone patient enough to listen. Perhaps that was why he had chosen this place. A world of the remembered dead seemed fitting company for a man piecing together the story of those the Imperium had chosen to forget. His study had once been a monitoring station for the servitors who maintained the orbital relays, a cramped space never meant for long-term living. Now it was buried beneath a mass of treasure from his long search, data slates stacked in towers, scrolls of genuine parchment curling at their edges in the recycled air, and bound books salvaged from archives that no longer knew they were missing them. The smell of old paper had seeped into everything, mingling with the life support systems and old metal walls of the place. Once he had been a lex mechanic of the Administratum's historical division, a keeper of records whose greatest excitement was the occasional discovery of a misfiled document from some forgotten compliance action, respectable work, safe work, the kind of quiet service that could carry a man through a lifetime without incident or distinction. Then he had found the first fragment, tucked inside a routine requisition report from the Great Crusade era, and his safe little life had ended. The station creaked around him, metal expanding and contracting as it passed through Horus Prime's shadow. Somewhere in the lower levels, a servitor went about its mindless maintenance rounds, its shuffling footsteps barely audible through the deck plating. These were the only sounds that broke the silence now, the groaning of old metal, the hum of struggling power systems, the soft scrape of automated servants who had forgotten. There was no one left to serve. Vorsh set down his cup and reached for the recording device that sat alone on the cleared space in front of him. It was an old unit, the kind that remembrances had once used to capture the testimonies of those who fought in the Great Crusade. He had traded 3 months of food rations for it, back when he still had things worth trading. The casing was scratched and worn, but the memory cores were sound. What he recorded here would survive, even if he did not. His finger hovered over the activation rune, and he was surprised to find that it was trembling. Not from fear, exactly. He had made his peace with fear long ago, in those first desperate weeks when he realized what he had discovered and what it would cost him. The Inquisition was searching for him. He knew this the way a hunted animal knows when predators are circling, a certainty that lived in his bones rather than his mind. They would find him eventually. They always did. But not yet, not today. And perhaps, if he was very lucky, if the Emperor still watched over fools who sought forbidden truths, not until he had finished what he came here to do. 3 years of chasing whispers, of piecing together a puzzle that the Imperium had spent 10,000 years trying to destroy. 3 years of learning to read between the lines of censored documents, of recognizing the shape of redactions and understanding what the silences meant. 3 years of slowly, painstakingly assembling a truth so dangerous that the very act of knowing it was a death sentence. He thought of the Emperor's sons, those 20 demigods who were meant to lead humanity to a golden age that never came. 20 Primarchs, the histories said, 20 legions founded to conquer the galaxy. But when you counted the names that appeared in the approved texts, when you tallied the statues in the great investuary of the Imperial palace, when you added up the loyal and the traitor alike, you only ever reached 18. 2 empty plinths stood in that sacred hall, which had stood empty for 10 millennia. 2 spaces where statues should have been, but were not. 2 silences in the roll call of the Emperor's sons, gaps that no official history acknowledged, and no sanctioned scholar was permitted to question. Vorsh had spent 3 years learning what those silences contained. He pressed the activation rune, and the device hummed softly to life, its recording light glowing a steady red in the dim room. For a long moment he simply sat there, listening to the quiet whir of its mechanisms. Then, in a voice roughened by years of solitude and recycled air, the former lex mechanic of the administratum began to speak of forbidden things. He spoke of 20 sons and 18 names. He spoke of brothers who had been erased so completely that even asking about them was a crime. He spoke of the forgotten and the purged, 2 tragedies that had preceded the Horus Heresy by decades, warnings written in empty plinths that no one had been permitted to heed. And as his words spilled out into the darkness of that lonely station, orbiting a world where billions of the dead lay silent, the story of the Lost Primarchs began to take shape once more, not as the Imperium would have it told, but as it truly was. There is a story that lies beneath all the other stories of our Imperium, a tale so old now that even its echoes have grown faint with the passing of 10,000 years, and it begins with a father and his sons. In the distant days before the Great Crusade had carried humanity's banners to the farthest stars, the Emperor of mankind labored in secret beneath the ancient mountains of terror, in chambers carved from living rock and sealed against the touch of time. There, in the soft glow of lumens that never flickered, and the quiet hum of machinery that would baffle even the brightest of minds, he undertook the greatest work of his long existence, the creation of 20 sons who would carry his vision to a galaxy waiting to be reclaimed. They were not born as you or I might understand birth, these Primarchs, but neither were they simply made, for there was love in their crafting, and purpose, and hope of a kind that even the master of mankind rarely permitted himself to express. Each one grew within an incubation pod, marked with a numeral in the old High Gothic script, and each one carried within his forming flesh a fragment of the Emperor's own essence, not merely his genetic code, though that too was woven through them, but something deeper and harder to name. A spark, perhaps, a reflection, 20 mirrors of divinity, each catching the light at a different angle. Some were shaped for war in its most terrible and necessary forms, their bodies destined to become temples of destruction that would break the enemies of mankind upon the anvil of their fury. Others carried gifts more subtle, minds that could hold the administration of entire star systems, or souls touched with the Psyker's sight, or hearts so vast that they might one day inspire billions to believe in something greater than themselves. The Emperor, it is said, designed each son for a purpose that only he fully understood. weaving their destinies together like threads in a tapestry whose final pattern remained his secret alone. They were to be generals, these Primarchs, each commanding a legion of warriors created from their own genetic template. The Space Marines, soldiers whose deeds would echo through the millennia. 20 fathers for 20 legions, and at the head of them all, the Emperor himself, guiding humanity toward a future free from the terrors that had haunted the Age of Strife. That was the dream that took shape in those laboratories beneath the mountains, and for a brief time it seemed that nothing in all the galaxy could prevent it. But there are powers in the universe that do not wish mankind well, and they had watched the Emperor's labors with eyes that burn in the spaces between stars. What happened next has been told and retold so many times across the long millennia that the truth of it has become something like a myth, worn smooth by the passage of countless retellings until only the shape of it remains. Some say the Chaos Gods themselves reached through the veil of reality with hands made of malice and tore the Primarchs from their cradles before they could draw their first breaths. Others speak of a great wound opening in the fabric of the universe, a storm in the warp of such fury that even the Emperor's protections could not hold against it. Still others whisper that the scattering served purposes beyond our understanding, that perhaps even tragedy may be woven into the designs of those who see further than we can imagine. What we know with certainty is only this. In a single cataclysmic moment, the 20 incubation pods vanished into the void, and the Primarchs were gone, scattered across the galaxy like seeds thrown to the cosmic winds. Each infant tumbled through the impossible distances between stars until he came to rest on some distant world, alone and far from the Father who had made them. And there each one grew, shaped by the world that had caught him in its gravity, molded by circumstances that the Emperor had never intended and could not have foreseen. Leman Russ learned the ways of the Wolfkin on frozen Fenris, where winter never truly ends, and strength is the only currency that matters. Gilliman was raised among the noble houses of Macragge, schooled in statecraft and philosophy by a foster father who recognized the greatness sleeping within the strange child who had fallen from the sky. Vulcan emerged from the volcanic crucible of Nocturne with a smith's patience and a heart vast enough to hold compassion for all humanity's children. Corvus Corax survived the brutal prison mines of Lycaeus and emerged as a liberator, a pale-skinned spectre of vengeance whose name the oppressors would learn to fear. One by one, across decades of patient searching, the Emperor found his scattered sons and brought them home to the legions that bore their blood. And for a time it seemed that the design had survived the scattering intact, perhaps even strengthened by the trials that had tempered each Primarch. 20 legions marched across the galaxy in those years, their banners bright against the darkness between stars, and 20 Primarchs led them toward a future that burned with promise. The Great Crusade rolled forward like a tide of hope and steel, gathering world after world into an imperium that grew greater with each passing year, and it must have seemed to those who lived through it that nothing could stand against the combined might of the Emperor and his sons. Humanity's long nightmare was ending at last. The scattered children of terror were coming home. The legions bore numbers from 1 to 20, each corresponding to a Primarch and the warriors who carried his genetic legacy. The Dark Angels marched as the first, the Lunar Wolves as the 16th, the Ultramarines as the 13th, and so the great roll call continued. 20 legions arrayed like the fingers of 2 mighty hands, reaching out to grasp the galaxy itself. And yet even in the oldest records that survive from those days, fragments salvaged from archives that were ancient before the heresy tore everything apart, There is something strange about the numbering. The sequence runs along its expected course, but it stutters in two places, hesitates around two numerals, as if the scribes who wrote those early accounts found their hands unwilling to form certain words. 2 and 11. Two numbers that appear only as silences where names should be. Gaps in the record that no amount of searching has ever been able to fill. There were Primarchs who bore those numerals once, and there were legions who marched beneath those banners. This much is certain, attested to by fragments that somehow escaped the terrible purging that would try to exterminate them from history. The warriors of the 2nd and 11th Legions fought in the Great Crusade alongside their brothers, bled on forgotten worlds for the Emperor's dream, conquered and built and served as faithfully as any of the 18, whose names we still remember. They existed as surely as Guilliman or Sanguinius or any of the others whose deeds still echo through the millennia. And then, for reasons that have been deliberately and thoroughly obscured, they simply ceased to exist at all. The term for what happened to them carries a weight that even now, 10,000 years later, makes scholars hesitate before speaking it aloud. Damnatio memoriae, the old High Gothic calls it, condemnation of memory, an edict of obliteration. It is the most terrible punishment the Imperium can render, reserved not for simple criminals or even traitors, but for those whose very existence has been judged too dangerous to remember. Not death alone, though death too must have come, but something worse than death, erasure. The systematic and remorseless destruction of every record, every monument, every mention of the condemned, until they become not figures in history, but holes in it, absences where presence once had been. The 2nd and 11th Legions received this sentence in full measure, and it was carried out with a thoroughness that shows the depth of whatever fear or shame drove it. Statues that had stood in places of honor were torn down and ground to powder, the dust used to line garden paths in the Imperial Palace, so that it might be walked upon by those who had consented to the forgetting. Records were burned or altered with such care that even the gaps they left were made to seem like natural spaces, rather than evidence of excision. The Primarchs' own brothers, those sons of the Emperor who had known the lost ones, who had perhaps fought beside them and called them kin, were forbidden by the Emperor himself to speak their names aloud ever again. It was, by any measure one might care to apply, the most successful edict of obliteration ever enacted in all the long and bloody history of the Imperium of man. 10,000 years have passed since those names were last spoken freely, and in all that time not a single verified name, not a single confirmed deed, not a single clear image of either lost Primarch has surfaced in any archive that scholars have been permitted to search. The forgetting was absolute, the silence complete. Only the questions remain now, hanging in the darkness like stars that refuse to set, and perhaps that is the cruelest part of all. What did they do to warrant an erasure more thorough than that of Horus himself, the traitor whose rebellion wounded the Emperor and condemned half the Imperium to the worship of mad gods? What shame could be so profound, what failure so catastrophic, that even their loyal brothers chose the mercy of forgetting over the burden of memory? The answers, if indeed they still exist anywhere in all the archives of mankind, lie buried beneath deliberate silence. But the fragments that survived, those few scattered pieces that somehow escaped the flames and the alterations, whisper of something terrible that happened before the heresy, something that the masters of the Imperium decided, in their infinite and awful wisdom, was better left unknown even to those who might have learned from it. Of the two brothers whose names have been taken from us, it is perhaps the elder in service, if not in discovery, whose absence leaves the stranger shape in Imperial history, for we know just enough of him to sense what we have lost, yet not nearly enough to understand why the losing was deemed necessary. He was among the first to be found, this quiet son, the third Primarch to be reunited with the Emperor after the scattering had thrown all 20 to the far corners of the galaxy. The records that survive from those years of the Great Crusade, fragments really, scraps that somehow escaped the burning, place his discovery at approximately 821 of the 30th millennium. If the chronologies can be trusted, it means that the master of the Second Legion walked beside his father and brothers for well over a century before whatever fate claimed him. 100 years and more of service to the Imperium, and yet we cannot say with certainty what color his legion's armor bore, or what symbol graced their standards, or even what name he answered to when his brothers called him to council. And yet one voice speaks to us across the millennia, offering a glimpse of the Primarch who would become the forgotten. Fulgrim of the Emperor's children, the proud and tragic son, left behind accounts of the Great Crusade's early years that somehow survived the various censorships and purges. In one such fragment, the Phoenician speaks of his brothers as they were before the heresy twisted everything. And there, in descriptions of warriors and statesmen and generals whose names still ring through history, he makes mention of one who stood apart from the rest. A contemplative and quiet man, Fulgrim called him. A soul possessed of little humor, whose silence in councils was not the silence of one who has nothing to say, but rather the stillness of deep water that moves according to currents, invisible from the surface. The Master of the Second, he names him, a title that tells us almost nothing, and yet somehow tells us everything, for it suggests a Primarch who was known more for his position than his personality, more for his role than his reputation. While brothers like Leman Russ or Jagatai Khan carved their names into legend through bold deeds and bolder words, the second Primarch seems to have been content to let his work speak for him, to lead his legion with a quiet competence that drew little attention, and perhaps preferred it that way. And yet this contemplative nature did not make him meek, nor did his quietude render him unwilling to speak hard truths when the moment demanded them. Fulgrim had recorded, with what sounds almost like grudging respect beneath the wounded pride, that when the Emperor's children numbered only 200 warriors, and their Primarch's ambitions already outstripped his legion's capacity to fulfill them, it was the Master of the Second who broke his characteristic silence to accuse Fulgrim of hubris. The quiet brother looked upon the proud one, and saw clearly the dangers that pride might bring, and he cared enough, or perhaps was honest enough, to say so aloud when others held their tongues. There is something almost prophetic in that accusation now, knowing as we do what Fulgrim would eventually become, though we must be careful not to read too much into fragments that were never meant to be read as historical accounts. Still, it tells us something important about the Forgotten One, that he possessed the clarity of vision to see flaws in his brothers that they could not see in themselves, and the courage to name those flaws even when silence would have been easier. One wonders whether he saw other things as well, whether those contemplative eyes perceived shadows gathering on horizons that his more boisterous brothers never thought to watch. It's interesting to think about what he might have warned them about, had he been given the chance. There is another fragment, more curious still, that has surfaced in the centuries since the heresy, a reference so brief and so hedged with uncertainty that scholars debate whether it refers to the second Primarch at all, or perhaps to his lost brother of the 11th. It speaks of an expedition to the Imgur monolith, a strange structure that stands upon the eastern fringe of the galaxy, in regions that even now remain poorly charted and less understood. The Imgur monolith is a thing of the Necrons, those deathless Xenos whose civilization was ancient before humanity's ancestors had learned to walk upright. And the fragment suggests that one of the Lost Primarchs led his legion to that black and silent structure in the early centuries of the Great Crusade. What they looked for there, and what they found, and whether the finding had anything to do with the fate that would later claim them. These are questions that the fragment does not answer, and perhaps cannot answer, for whoever wrote it seems to have known little more than we do now. But if it was indeed the master of the second who ventured to that haunted place, then perhaps we might understand why a Primarch of contemplative nature would be drawn to such a mystery. The Ymga monolith stands as one of the galaxy's great enigmas, a monument to sciences and purposes that even the most learned members of the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot fathom, and a soul given to deep thought and quiet study might well have felt its pull across the stars. Perhaps he went seeking knowledge, perhaps he went seeking understanding, perhaps he went seeking answers to questions that his brothers had never thought to ask. And perhaps, though this is speculation of the most dangerous kind, he found something there that changed him, or changed how others perceived him, in ways that would eventually contribute to his removal from all memory. When scholars speak of the two Lost Primarchs in the rare texts that acknowledge them at all, they often use a particular phrase: the forgotten and the purged. It is a distinction that paints something of a picture about the two men, though its precise meaning has been debated across the millennia by those brave or foolish enough to study such forbidden subjects. To be purged suggests violence and active destruction, a threat eliminated through force of arms, but to be forgotten suggests something different, a quieter ending, a deliberate setting, a side, a shame buried rather than a danger destroyed. If the master of the second was indeed the forgotten half of that terrible pairing, then perhaps his fate was not the spectacular catastrophe that we might imagine when we think of Primarchs falling. Perhaps there was no great battle, no dramatic confrontation, no moment of crisis that forced the Emperor's hand. Perhaps instead there was only a slow accumulation of concerns, a growing unease among his brothers and his father, until one day the decision was made that he could no longer be permitted to continue, and that the kindest thing for everyone would be to proceed as though he had never existed at all. The contemplative man erased contemplatively, the quiet brother given a quiet ending. There is a terrible symmetry to it, if indeed that is what happened, a poetry of the cruelest kind. The evidence we have, such as it is fragmentary and unreliable, and hedged about with 10,000 years of deliberate obscuration, suggests that the Second Legion's destruction came before that of the 11th, possibly during or in the aftermath of the Rangdan Xenocides, those catastrophic campaigns against Xenos so terrible that the Imperium nearly broke beneath their onslaught. Both lost legions are confirmed to have fought in those desperate wars, and it may be that whatever befell the master of the second had its roots in the horrors he witnessed there, or in choices he made when all choices seemed equally dark. But these are only shadows of possibilities, shapes glimpsed through fog that will never fully lift. The truth of what happened to the second Primarch died with those who enacted his forgetting, and Malkador the Sigillite, who surely knew more than any other mortal soul, took that knowledge with him when he finally fell. We have now been left with only absence, a contemplative man who saw clearly and spoke truly, and led his legion through a century of war, reduced now to a handful of fragments and a title that tells us he was master of something we are no longer permitted to name. The forgotten one, buried so deeply in silence that even his brothers, those who survived the heresy and its aftermath, could no longer recall his face or his voice or the color of his eyes when they tried to remember him in their private grief. 200 years he might have lived, or 300 or more. We cannot know, for the records of his ending are as thoroughly destroyed as the records of his beginning. We know only that he was among the first to be found, and that his finding brought the emperor no lasting joy. We know that he was quiet and thoughtful, and possessed of a clarity that let him see hubris in a brother who would not see it in himself. And we know that when the time came to erase him from history, whoever made that decision chose the word forgotten rather than purged, as though what he represented was a sorrow to be buried, a wound too painful to look upon, a loss that could only be borne by pretending it had never occurred. The forgotten, the quiet brother, the master of the second. He deserved a better remembrance than silence, one would think. But silence is all we have left to give him now. If the master of the second was the quiet tragedy of the Lost Primarchs, then his brother of the 11th was something else entirely. A story cut short so swiftly and so violently that one might almost call it merciful, if mercy could ever be found in such complete destruction. He was the last of the lost to be found, this nameless son, the 19th Primarch to be reunited with a father who had spent decades searching the galaxy for the children that the warp had stolen from him. The records place his discovery at approximately 900 to 27 in the 30th millennium. For while his brother of the second had walked beside the Emperor for more than a century before whatever fate claimed him, the Primarch of the 11th Legion would have barely 35 or 40 years of service before his name was struck from every record, his deeds erased from every chronicle, his very existence condemned to an oblivion more complete than death. 35 years, in the span of a Primarch's life, in the vast sweep of the Great Crusade that was reshaping the galaxy itself, such a time is barely a heartbeat, long enough to learn the ways of war, perhaps. Long enough to lead a legion in a handful of campaigns and begin to make a name that might echo through history, but not long enough to leave the kind of mark that cannot be erased. One wonders if this brevity was part of why the forgetting was so successful, if the 11th Primarch simply had not been present long enough to carve himself deeply into the memories of those who would be commanded to forget him. Or perhaps the opposite is true. Perhaps whatever he did, whatever he became, happened so quickly and so catastrophically that there was no time for the slow accumulation of legacy that might have made his erasure more difficult. Found late, destroyed early, and the space between those two events filled with something so terrible that even now, 10,000 years later, no one will speak of what it was. There is a vision that haunts the chronicles of the heresy, a glimpse behind the veil that separates what is from what might have been, and it speaks to us of the 11th Primarch in ways that perhaps its original witness never intended. When Horus Lupercal, greatest of the Emperor's sons and the one who would ultimately become the arch-traitor, lay wounded on the moon of Davin, struck down by a blade of chaos that carried poisons our medicine could not cure, he was taken by his desperate warriors to the temple of the Serpent Lodge, where the priests of that world practiced old and dark arts. There, in the grip of fevered dreams sent by powers of chaos, the future War Master experienced a vision that carried him backward through time itself, to the very moment when the Primarchs were scattered from their father's laboratory beneath the mountains of terror. Horus walked through that sacred space in his dreaming, past the incubation tanks that had once held his brothers, past the empty vessels from which the warp had torn them one by one. And he stopped before the tank marked with the number 11, and he laid his hand upon the glass, and he felt something that would stay with him long after the fever broke, and the darkness that had touched him began its slow work of corruption. He felt, the record says, the untapped glories that might have lain ahead for what grew within. And he knew, with the certainty that visions sometimes bring, that those glories would never come to pass. There is something sad in that image, if one allows oneself to dwell upon it. Horus standing before the tank of a brother he would never truly know, mourning a future that had been foreclosed before it could begin. The vision suggests that even before the scattering, even before the infant Primarchs were thrown to the far corners of the galaxy to be shaped by worlds they had never been meant to inhabit, something about the 11th's fate was already sealed. Whether this was foreknowledge granted by the Chaos powers who sent the vision, or some deeper truth about the nature of destiny itself, the record does not say. It gives us only Horus's grief for what might have been, and his certainty that whatever slumbered in that tank would never be permitted to flower. Untapped glories, a life unlived, a story that would end before it truly began. And yet the 11th Primarch did live for a time. He was found on some distant world, whose name has been erased along with his own, raised by people whose culture and customs have been obliterated from all memory. He took command of a legion that had been waiting for him across the decades of searching, warriors who bore his genetic legacy and who must have greeted his arrival with the same joy that every legion felt when their father finally came home to them. He fought in the Great Crusade, led campaigns, made decisions that shaped the fates of worlds, all the things that Primarchs did, all the duties that came with being a son of the Emperor. And then, in the space of what seems to have been a terribly short time, something went wrong. We have one more fragment, one more glimpse through the veil that shrouds these lost brothers, and it comes to us from a confrontation that took place in the final years before the heresy tore everything apart. Horus, by then the War Master, the greatest of the Emperor's generals, the one in whom his father had placed the most trust, learned that Malkador the Sigillite had ordered the destruction of one of the Lost Primarchs' statues in the Imperial palace. The precise circumstances are unclear, as is which statue was being torn down, but the story has been preserved in accounts that somehow escaped the burning of so many other records. Horus confronted the Sigillite, and with him came Alpharius and Jagatai Khan, brothers who shared his outrage at what they saw as a desecration of their family's history. The War Master's words ring across the millennia with a fury that even now carries genuine grief. The history of the Imperium is not something that can be amended. We will not allow it. But Malkador was unmoved. He spoke of the fallen Primarch as disgraced, called the statue a tribute unworthy of the palace, and when Horus pressed him, when the greatest of the Emperor's sons demanded that the Sigillites speak the name that was being erased, something terrible happened. Horus began to speak the name himself. My brother's name was... And Malkador struck him, not with fist or blade, but with the full weight of a psychic gift second only to the Emperor's own. A blow that hammered into Horus's mind like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. The War Master, the greatest warrior humanity had ever produced, the general before whom entire civilizations had knelt in surrender, was driven to his knees by a mortal man whose body was ancient and frail, but whose mind was forged of something harder than adamantium. What came from Horus's lips after that strike was not a name, but a ruin of one, syllables broken and scattered by the assault upon his mind. He found that he could not even say the name. Scholars have debated those fragments for millennia. Was Horus attempting to speak a name, something beginning with those syllables, perhaps a name that shared sounds with Malkador's own title? Or was he simply trying to address the Sigillite, to plead or to curse, and found even that simple act beyond his power in the grip of such terrible psychic force? The truth is that we cannot know, for Malcador himself never spoke of it afterward, and Horus would soon fall to darkness. Far deeper than any mystery of lost brothers, all we have are those broken sounds echoing across 10,000 years of silence. There is one final piece of evidence, slender as spider silk, but fascinating for what it suggests. In the great tables that list the Space Marine legions, published in the Forge World records of the Horus Heresy, the names of the Lost Primarchs are covered by bars of solid black, redactions that obscure what was once written there. And people who have studied these bars with careful eyes have noted something curious about their lengths. The bar that covers the 11th Primarch's name is approximately the same length as the bar that would be needed to cover Magnus the Red. It is not proof of anything, this measurement of shadows, but it suggests that whoever the 11th was, he bore a name of similar construction to the Crimson King's own, either a name in two parts, or a name followed by some title or epithet that distinguished him from his brothers, a name that might have rung through history alongside all the others, had history been permitted to remember it. Instead, there is only the black bar and the silence it represents, and the broken syllables that Horus choked out before Malcador's wrath silenced him entirely. The purged, the erased, the brother whose name was so dangerous that speaking it could bring even the War Master to his knees. Whatever he was, whatever he did, whatever he might have become, had fate allowed him the centuries that his brothers were granted. All of it is gone now, swept away by an edict of obliteration, so thorough that even the shape of what was lost can only be guessed at through fragments and shadows and the terrible weight of absence. There are wars that shape the destiny of civilizations, and there are wars that nearly end them. And then there is the Rangdan Xenocides, a conflict so devastating, so absolutely catastrophic in its scope and cost, that even now, 10 millennia later, those who study the histories of the Great Crusade speak of it in low tones, as though the act of remembering might somehow call back the horrors that humanity barely survived. It began in the 860s of the 30th millennium, when the expanding fleets of the Great Crusade breached the eastern fringe of the galaxy and encountered something that had been waiting there in the darkness between stars, patient, ancient, and hungry, in ways that would show themselves to be devastating. The Rangda, they were called, though whether this was their own name for themselves, or simply the label that terrified Imperial forces assigned to the nightmares that came screaming out of the void, it is not clear. What the records do say, in language that grows more fragmented and fearful the closer one reads, is that these Xenos possessed capabilities that the Imperium had never before encountered, and was utterly unprepared to face. Neural enslavement. The words sit cold upon the page, but they cannot capture the horror of what they describe. The Rangda did not just kill their enemies, they took them, body and mind, turning loyal soldiers of the Emperor into weapons against their own brothers, through means that even the Mechanicum's most learned magi could not comprehend or counter. Imagine facing a foe that does not need to defeat your armies when it can simply claim them, turning every warrior you send against it into another soldier in its endless ranks. This was the enemy that awaited humanity on the eastern fringe, and when the war began in earnest, it seemed for a time that the Great Crusade itself might break upon that terrible shore. The losses exceeded anything the Imperium had suffered before, and would not be matched again until the Horus Heresy tore everything apart from within. Whole expeditionary fleets went to their deaths, without a single survivor returning to tell what had befallen them. Thousands of ships, millions of soldiers, simply gone, swallowed by the darkness as though they had never existed. Worlds that had been brought into compliance at tremendous cost were laid waste, their populations either slaughtered or worse, taken by the Rangda to serve their own needs. Dozens of Titan legions were obliterated entirely, their mighty mechanical bodies reduced to wreckage, scattered across planets whose names have been stricken from every chart. And the Space Marine legions, those warriors who had seemed invincible in their march across the stars, yearned, in the fires of the Rangdan campaigns, what it meant to face an enemy that could match them in both ferocity and horror. The Dark Angels, the First Legion, pride of the Emperor's armies and bearers of traditions that stretched back to the very dawn of the Great Crusade, were reduced to perhaps a tenth of their former strength. 10%. 9 in every 10 of those proud warriors who had marched into the Eastern Fringe never marched out again. Their genes seed lost, their names added to rolls of the dead that grew so long that the scribes who maintained them wept as they wrote. Other legions suffered proportionally, their ranks thinned by attrition so severe that recovery would take decades, if recovery came at all. It is in this context of absolute catastrophe that we must consider the fate of the lost legions, for both the 2nd and the 11th are confirmed to have fought in the Rangdan genocides, and the timing of their erasure aligns with the aftermath of those campaigns. The confirmation comes to us through an accident, a bureaucratic error of the sort that sometimes allows truth to slip through the cracks of even the most thorough censorship. A record was mistakenly included in copies of the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer, that handbook given to every soldier of the Astra Militarum, and this record spoke plainly of what official histories have labored so hard to obscure. The 2nd and 11th Legions, it stated, participated in the campaigns of the Rangdan genocides during the 8608s, if the 30th millennium. Their involvement is confirmed, their presence on those blood-soaked battlefields established beyond reasonable doubt. What happened to them there, and whether what happened contributed to their eventual destruction, we cannot know. But there is another fragment, preserved in the Forge World Chronicles of the Horus Heresy, that speaks to the fate of legions during the Rangdan campaigns, in language that chills the blood. The passage recounts the terrible toll of the war, the fleets lost, the worlds destroyed, the Titan legions annihilated. And then it says this: by the end, entire Space Marine Legion's redacted section had been lost to the Imperium. The redaction sits in the middle of that sentence like a wound, a gap where meaning should be found. Lost to the Imperium, but how? The word lost can mean many things. It can mean destroyed, certainly. Wiped out by an enemy too powerful to overcome. But it can also mean something else, something darker, something that the Rangda's particular capabilities make terribly plausible. Lost can mean taken. The Rangda enslaved minds. This is established fact, recorded in every account of the war that has survived the millennia. They turned loyal servants of the Emperor into puppets dancing on strings of alien will, and neither faith nor training, nor the genetic enhancements of the Adeptus Astartes, provided reliable protection against their methods. If common soldiers could be claimed, if Titan crews could be turned, if entire populations could be subverted in the space of days or hours, what of the Primarchs themselves? Could one of those Primarchs, the quiet master of the 2nd, or his ill-fated brother of the 11th, have been compromised by the Rangda? Could a son of the Emperor, a being of such power and will that he was designed to be incorruptible, have fallen prey to neural enslavement so complete that he turned against everything he had been created to protect? Could an entire legion have followed their father into that darkness, not through choice or corruption in the manner of the later traitors, but through a violation of their very minds that left them no more capable of resistance than a servitor is capable of questioning its programming. The timing haunts those who study these forbidden histories. The Rangdan genocides reached their peak in the 860s of the 30th millennium. The lost legions were erased from all records, sometime around 962 to 969, within years, perhaps within months, of the campaign's conclusion. Both legions are confirmed to have fought in those wars. Both legions emerged from those wars, and then, shortly afterward, ceased to exist. Correlation is not causation, as the scholars remind us. The timing might be coincidence, the alignment of dates nothing more than the random clustering of unrelated events. Perhaps what happened to the 2nd and 11th legions had nothing to do with the Rangda at all. Perhaps their destruction stemmed from entirely different failures, entirely different shames, and their presence in the genocides is merely an incidental detail in a story whose true shape has been hidden from us. But the redaction in the middle of that sentence will not let us rest easy with such reassurances. Entire Space Marine legions had been lost to the Imperium. Someone, at some point, knew exactly how those legions were lost, and that someone, or their successors, decided that the knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. Not just painful, not merely shameful, but dangerous. Whatever happened to the lost legions in the aftermath of the Rangdan genocides, it was something that the masters of the Imperium decided we must never be allowed to know. And so we are left with questions that have no answers, possibilities that cannot be confirmed or denied, and a silence that grows louder the more closely we examine it. The Rangda are gone now, destroyed or driven back into whatever darkness spawned them. Their threat to humanity ended millennia ago, but the shadow they cast across the history of the Great Crusade remains, and in that shadow, 2 legions disappeared forever. The crucible of the genocides tested every warrior who passed through it. Most emerged scarred but intact, their loyalty proven in the fires of the most terrible war humanity had yet faced. But some, it seems, did not emerge at all, or emerge so changed that those who loved them best decided it would be kinder to pretend they had never existed. Every family has its secrets, and every kingdom its necessary cruelties, and in the vast and terrible family of the Emperor's sons, there was one brother who bore a burden that none of the others envied: the role of executioner, the wolf set loose when all other options had been exhausted, the blade that fell when judgment had been rendered, and mercy was no longer possible. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves did not choose this duty, so far as any record tells us. It was placed upon him by a father who understood, perhaps better than any being who has ever lived, that even the grandest designs may require pruning, that even the most beloved sons may disappoint, and that when such disappointments grow dangerous enough to threaten everything that has been built, there must be someone willing to do what must be done. The Wolf King accepted this burden, the way he accepted all things, with a pragmatism that his more romantic brothers sometimes mistook for savagery, but which those who knew him better understood as a kind of terrible love. He loved the Imperium enough to be its executioner. He loved his father enough to carry out judgments that broke something inside him with each execution. And he loved his brothers, even those he was sent to destroy, enough to ensure that their endings, when they came, were swift and certain, rather than drawn out in the slow agony of siege and attrition. This was the role of the Space Wolves in the days before the heresy. Not just warriors, though they were fearsome in battle, but instruments of sanction, the Emperor's final recourse when a threat was too terrible or too shameful for normal warfare to address. Other legions conquered worlds and crushed Xeno's empires, and brought the light of the Imperium to corners of the galaxy. The wolves did all of this as well, but they also waited for the summons that might come at any moment. The command to turn their fangs not against aliens or heretics, but against their own kind. It was a lonely burden, and Russ bore it largely in silence, for what could he say to brothers who might one day find themselves on the wrong end of his judgment? What bonds of fellowship could survive the knowledge that the wolf at your side might one day be ordered to tear out your throat? The evidence that the Space Wolves carried out the destruction of the Lost Legions is scattered across the fragmentary records of the Great Crusade, but when assembled, it forms a picture that admits little doubt. In the great timeline of the Crusade's final years, preserved in the Forge World Chronicles that have become our most reliable source for this dark period, there are two entries that stand out from all the others, not for what they say, but for what they refuse to say. The year 965 of the 30th millennium contains an entry marked simply "All data redacted," with only a single notation surviving the censorship. Space Wolves' involvement confirmed. 4 years later, in 969 of the 30th millennium, an identical entry appears, "All data redacted, Space Wolves' involvement confirmed." 2 operations, 4 years apart, both so sensitive that even 10,000 years later, the Imperium will not acknowledge what occurred. The timing aligns with what we know of the Lost Legion's fate. Rogel Dawn, in his contemplation of the empty plinths in the Imperial Palace, spoke of separate tragedies, 2 distinct catastrophes, not a single shared doom. If the second Primarch fell first, as the evidence suggests, then the year 965 might mark the date when the wolves were unleashed against him and his legion. And if the 11th followed 4 years later, his own brief and troubled existence brought to its violent conclusion, then 969 might be the date that no one is permitted to remember. 2 brothers, 2 executions, 2 entries in the historical record that have been scrubbed clean of everything, except the notation that tells us who carried out the deed. But the most damning evidence comes not from timelines or redacted entries, but from the words of Leman Russ himself, words spoken in an unguarded moment, preserved by a remembrancer who perhaps did not fully understand the weight of what he was recording. In the days before the burning of Prospero, when the Space Wolves were preparing to carry out the Emperor's judgment against Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons, a mortal chronicler named Caspar Hauser found himself in conversation with the Wolf King. The subject turned, as such conversations often did in those troubled times, to the unprecedented nature of what was about to occur. Space Marines sent to make war upon Space Marines, brothers ordered to destroy brothers, the unthinkable made suddenly and terribly real. "There's a first time for everything," Hauser observed, speaking with the innocent confidence of a man who did not know how wrong he was. Russ laughed at this, but the sound that emerged from that mighty throat was not the booming mirth that usually accompanied the Wolf King's humor. It was something else, something that Hauser described as a sad sound, heavy with a grief that the Primarch rarely permitted others to witness. "That?" Russ replied, and there was a weight in that single word that spoke of memories he would rather not carry. "No, that's not unprecedented." Not unprecedented. The Space Wolves had sanctioned legions before. Russ had led his sons against his brothers before Prospero, before the Heresy, before the galaxy learned what betrayal truly meant. He carried within him the knowledge of what it felt like to destroy those who shared his blood. And that knowledge had left scars that even a Primarch's constitution could not fully heal. If any doubt remained about what befell the lost legions at the hands of the Sixth, it is dispelled by testimony from an unexpected source, a dreadnought of the World Eater's Legion named Lork, who had served as Legion Master of the 12th before Angron's discovery, and who carried within his ancient shell memories that stretched back to the earliest days of the Great Crusade. Speaking to a fellow warrior in a moment of reflection, Lork stated the truth that official histories had labored so hard to obscure. Twice before the Emperor has purged his own progeny and every living soul within the legions that followed them. The words land like hammer blows. Twice before, not losses in battle, not tragic accidents, not the quiet fading of legions that could not sustain themselves, purges, deliberate and total, ordered by the Emperor himself, and carried out against his own sons and all who followed them. The Lost Primarchs did not simply disappear. They were destroyed, along with every warrior who bore their genetic legacy, and the destruction was sanctioned at the highest level of Imperial authority. And if such purges required an executioner, who else could it have been but Leman Russ and his wolves? There is a conversation recorded between Malcador the Sigillite and the Wolf King that took place during the dark days of the heresy, when half the Imperium had turned traitor, and it seemed that everything the Emperor had built might crumble to ash. The Sigillite, the ancient keeper of secrets, spoke to Russ of the Primarchs and their various failings, the pride of Fulgrim, the obsession of Perturabo, the bitterness of Mortarion, all the flaws that had made them vulnerable to the seductions of chaos. So many of the others have been disappointments, Malcador said, and there was a weariness in his voice that even his formidable will could not entirely conceal. First those we do not name, then Horus and the rest. Those we do not name, even in private conversation with one of the few beings in the galaxy he could trust absolutely, Malcador would not speak the names of the Lost Primarchs, but he acknowledged their existence, acknowledged that they had been disappointments, the first disappointments, the original failures, the sons who had fallen short of their father's hopes before Horus ever dreamed of rebellion. And then the Sigillite said something else, something that illuminates the terrible role that Russ had been forced to play. But not you. Not you. Of all the Emperor's sons, Leman Russ had never disappointed. He had done everything asked of him, carried every burden placed upon his shoulders, executed every judgment no matter how much it cost him. The other Primarchs had their pride, their ambitions, their secret doubts and private rebellions against the roles they had been assigned. Russ had only his duty, and he had fulfilled it without fail. Even when fulfilling it meant destroying brothers he might have loved. It is easy, perhaps, to cast the Wolf King as a villain in this tale. The executioner is rarely beloved, and those who carry out harsh judgments are often remembered more for the blood on their hands than for the grief in their hearts. But the evidence suggests that Russ took no pleasure in what he was commanded to do, that each execution carved away something from his soul that would never grow back, that he bore the title of the Emperor's executioner, not as a mark of pride, but as a brand of sacrifice. Someone had to do it. Someone had to be willing to turn on his own brothers when his brothers posed a threat too great to be tolerated. Someone had to carry the memory of what he had done, even when everyone else was commanded to forget. Leman Russ was that someone. And when the time came, he did what was required of him. And then he lived with the weight of it for all the years that followed. The loyal executioner, the reliable son, the wolf who hunted his own pack when the pack turned rabid. Whatever sins the Lost Primarchs committed, whatever failures led to their destruction, Russ was the instrument of their ending. And that knowledge, one suspects, haunted him far more than any enemy he ever faced in battle. In the long history of the Imperium, there have been many keepers of secrets, inquisitors and spy masters, archivists and confessors, all those whose duty it is to know what others must not. But none of them, in all the millennia that have passed since humanity first reached for the stars, have ever borne a burden quite like that which rested upon the shoulders of Malkador the Sigillite, the servant of the Emperor, whose very name has become synonymous with the keeping of truths too dangerous to speak aloud. He was older than many would believe. This man who was not entirely a man anymore, his body withered by the passage of centuries that should have claimed him long before the Great Crusade began. Some whispered that he was a perpetual, one of those rare souls cursed or blessed with an immortality. Others said he had simply refused to die, holding himself together through sheer force of will until his appointed tasks were complete. Whatever the truth of his longevity, one thing was certain. Malkador wielded psychic power second only to the Emperor himself among all the baseline humans who had ever lived, a gift of the mind so vast and so terrible that even the Primarchs had learned to treat him with a respect that bordered on fear. He was the regent of terror, the voice of the Emperor in all matters of governance and administration, the hand that guided the Imperium's course when its creator was occupied with more pressing concerns. But more than this, more than any title or office, Malkador was the keeper of the Imperium's deepest and most terrible secrets. And chief among those secrets was the truth of what had befallen the Lost Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th Legions. It was Malkador who had overseen their removal from history. It was Malkador who had ordered the destruction of their monuments, the burning of their records, the systematic elimination of every trace that might remind the Imperium that they had ever existed. And it was Malkador who enforced the silence that followed, with a ruthlessness that spared no one, not even the greatest of the Emperor's remaining sons. We have spoken already of the confrontation with Horus, who did not come alone to confront the Sigillite. With him came Alfarius of the Alpha Legion, and Jagatai Khan of the White Scars, the warhawk whose fierce independence had always set him somewhat apart from the others. 3 sons of the Emperor, 3 demigods whose combined might could have conquered worlds, standing before a withered old man whose body seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. And yet it was the old man who held all the power in that room. Alfarius spoke of sacrifice, of the price that all the Primarchs knew might one day be demanded of them. He argued that even a fallen brother deserved to be remembered, that to erase a life entirely was a cruelty beyond mere execution. The Khan said nothing, but his presence alone spoke volumes. The warhawk, who valued freedom above almost all else, standing in solidarity against the tyranny of enforced forgetting. After striking Horus with that psychic blow, Malkador spoke, and his voice carried a weight that made the very air seem to tremble. Enough. You will be silent, or I will unmake you, here and now. It was not an idle threat. In that moment, everyone in that chamber understood with perfect clarity that Malkador the Sigillite could have destroyed Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the greatest of the Primarchs, the Emperor's most beloved son, through sheer force of will alone. The power that the old man wielded was not just sufficient to wound or incapacitate. It was sufficient to annihilate, to erase a being who had been designed to be unkillable, to do to Horus what had already been done to the brothers whose memory he had tried to defend. Only the desperate intervention of the others broke the moment. Alfarius pleaded for the Sigillite to stop, his voice carrying an edge of genuine fear that the Lord of the Alpha Legion rarely permitted others to hear. The Khan bellowed Malkador's title like a battle cry, demanding that he release his hold before it was too late. And Malkador, after a long moment in which the outcome hung upon the edge of a knife, relented. Horus collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his body reduced to something almost pitiful by the experience of helplessness that few Primarchs had ever known. "You have no earthly concept of what has been sacrificed," Malcador said, and there was something in his voice that might have been grief, or might have been anger, or might have been both woven together into an emotion that had no name, "just so that you may ascend." But perhaps the most terrible revelation regarding Malcador's role in the forgetting comes not from confrontations or displays of power, but from a quieter moment, a conversation in a hidden chamber deep beneath the Imperial palace, where secrets were kept that even the keepers of secrets did not speak of lightly. Rogel Dawn, Praetorian of Terror and master of the Imperial Fists, discovered this chamber by accident during the days of the Heresy, when work crews breaching sealed sections of the palace stumbled upon doors marked with odd numerals. The workers died, claimed by psychic traps that had waited 10,000 years to spring, and Dawn went to investigate what had killed them. There, in the darkness beneath the palace, he found Malcador waiting for him. And there, the sigillite revealed a truth that shattered everything Dawn thought he knew about the Lost Primarchs, and the forgetting that had claimed them. The memory suppression had not been imposed by tyranny. It had been requested by Dawn himself and by Guilliman, two of the most loyal and level-headed of all the Emperor's sons. They had gone to Malcador and asked him to erase their memories of their lost brothers, to take from them the knowledge of what had happened, because that knowledge would have threatened the core ideals of the Great Crusade itself. This was not a secret kept from the Primarchs against their will. This was a burden that at least some of them had chosen to bear, preferring the mercy of forgetting to the agony of remembrance. But Malcador offered Dawn a choice that night in the hidden chamber. He could, if Dawn wished it, temporarily restore the memories that had been suppressed, let the Praetorians see once more what he had asked to forget, so that he might judge whether the forgetting had truly been the right decision. Dawn accepted, and what he saw when those memories flooded back into his mind broke something inside him that would never fully heal. The accounts describe his reaction as something approaching panic. Rogel Dawn, who had never flinched from any enemy, who had fortified terror itself against the forces of chaos, who embodied duty and stoicism and unshakable resolve, reduced to a state of horror so profound that he could barely form words. Whatever he witnessed in those restored memories, whatever truth came rushing back into his consciousness after years of blessed ignorance, it was something he considered worse than the Horus Heresy itself, worse than his father's mortal wounding, worse than the Imperium's sundering, worse than all the betrayals and massacres that had defined the darkest chapter in human history. And when Malcador offered to restore the suppression, to take those terrible memories away once more, Dawn agreed without hesitation. He chose to forget again. He chose the mercy of ignorance over the burden of truth. The chamber was sealed. The memories faded, and Rogel Dawn walked away from that place with the knowledge that he had once known something so terrible that even he, the Praetorian, the unbreakable, could not bear to carry it. This is the weight that Malcador bore for all the years of his long service, not just the keeping of secrets, but the keeping of secrets so awful that even demigods begged to have them taken away. He was the architect of forgetting, the guardian of truths too dangerous to remember, the one who carried what others could not carry and remembered what others could not bear to recall. And when he finally fell, spending the last of his strength to hold the golden throne, while the emperor was taken to be interred upon it, he took those secrets with him into whatever rest awaits such souls. The names of the Lost Primarchs, the truth of what befell them, the horror that made Rogel Dawn choose amnesia over memory. All of it died with Malcador the Sigillite and perhaps that is exactly as he intended. Some truths, after all, are too dangerous to survive their keeper. When we speak of the Lost Primarchs and the fate that claimed them, it is easy to forget that they did not stand alone, that behind each of those vanished demigods marched tens of thousands of warriors who bore their genetic legacy. Space Marines who had fought and bled and conquered in the name of fathers who would one day be condemned to oblivion. What became of these sons when their fathers were destroyed? What fate awaited the warriors of legions, whose very existence was being scrubbed from every record in the Imperium? The answer, when it comes to us through the broken records that survived the Great Forgetting, is both more merciful and more terrible than simple destruction. Malcador the Sigillite, in the hidden chamber beneath the Imperial Palace, where he revealed so many terrible truths to Rogel Dawn, spoke of the lost legions of Space Marines with something that might almost have been compassion, or at least the cold calculation of a man who understood. That even in judgment, there must be limits to the cruelty inflicted upon the innocent. They did not share their Primarch's fates, the Sigillite confirmed, and in those words lies the first truth we must understand. The Space Marines of the 2nd and 11th Legions were not slaughtered alongside the fathers they had served. Whatever crimes their Primarchs committed, whatever failures led to their destruction, the warriors who followed them were deemed blameless, too blameless, perhaps, to be condemned to death for sins that were not their own. But survival came at a cost that some might consider worse than dying. The Marines were mind-wiped, Malcador explained, their memories erased by psychic techniques that left no trace of who they had been or whom they had served. Everything that made them warriors of the 2nd or 11th Legion, their battle honors, their brotherhood, their pride in the heraldry they wore, and the Primarch whose blood flowed in their veins, all of it was taken from them, scraped away like rust from iron, until only the bare metal of their Astartes conditioning remained. And then they were attuned to new circumstances, the Sigillite said, using a clinical phrase for an unknown process. New identities were implanted in minds that had been emptied of everything they once contained. New loyalties were inscribed upon souls that had been scraped clean of the old. Warriors who had fought beneath one banner for decades awoke believing they had always served another, their memories of campaigns and brothers and a father's voice replaced by fabrications so thorough that even they could not distinguish the false from the true. Malcador called it an act of mercy, and perhaps in his own way he believed that. The warriors were too useful to be discarded, he said, too valuable, too thoroughly trained, too desperately needed in a galaxy that devoured soldiers faster than even the Great Crusade could produce them. To destroy them alongside their Primarchs would have been a waste that the Imperium could not afford, and so they were preserved after a fashion, even as everything they had once been was systematically annihilated. But preserved where? If tens of thousands of Space Marines were stripped of their identities and given new ones? What legions received these ghost soldiers, these warriors whose true origins had been hidden even from themselves? There is a theory that has persisted across the millennia, whispered in corners where such whispers are permitted. It concerns the Ultramarines, the most numerous and most organized of the legions, and their remarkable growth during the very years when the 2nd and 11th Legions were being erased from history. By the time of the Horus Heresy, the Ultramarines numbered approximately 250,000 Space Marines, by far the largest legion, eclipsing even the Iron Warriors and Word-Bearers who had themselves grown vast through decades of aggressive recruitment. This growth has been attributed to many factors: the administrative genius of Guilliman, the stable gene seed that made Ultramarines recruitment unusually successful, the access to 500 worlds that provided an endless stream of suitable candidates. All of these explanations are true so far as they go. But there are those who believe they do not tell the whole story. Word-bearer captains of the Gal Vorbak, speaking among themselves in a moment preserved by records, discussed the Ultramarines' growth with a frankness that borders on the dangerous. The 13th definitely swelled to eclipse all the other legions around the time the 2nd and 11th were forgotten by Imperial archives. The speaker did not state as fact that the Ultramarines had absorbed the survivors of the lost legions. Such a statement would have been too direct, too dangerous, too close to truths that even chaos-touched warriors hesitated to speak aloud. But the implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. The timing was too convenient to be mere coincidence. We cannot know with certainty whether this theory is true. The Ultramarines themselves, if they carry the blood of vanished brothers in their ranks, would have no way of knowing it. The mind-wiping was too thorough, the implanted memories too complete, the erasure of original identities too absolute to permit any trace of the truth to survive. A warrior who believes himself an Ultramarine, whose every memory confirms that he has always been an Ultramarine, whose brothers accept him without question as one of their own. How could such a warrior ever discover that his true origins lie elsewhere? He could not. That is the point, that is the mercy, if mercy it can be called, that Malkador extended to the lost legion survivors. And yet the gene seed tells its own story, in ways that even the most thorough deletion cannot entirely suppress. 10,000 years after the lost legions were destroyed, the Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Carl, that ancient and brilliant servant of the machine god, whose works had reshaped the very nature of the Space Marines, revealed that he possessed viable gene seed from both vanished legions. Preserved in the deepest vaults of Mars, maintained across the millennia by processes that only the Mechanicum fully understood, the genetic legacy of the 2nd and 11th Primarchs had survived their destruction. When Call sought permission to use these gene stocks for the creation of new Primaris Marines, his proxy machine, the Call Inferior, an artificial intelligence that spoke with the Archmagos' voice and authority, made an argument that cuts to the heart of what the lost legions truly were. The warriors were not at fault. The science is not at fault. Their Primarchs were. The warriors were not at fault. In that simple statement lies a truth that the Imperium has labored for 10,000 years to obscure. The Space Marines of the 2nd and 11th Legions were innocent. They served faithfully, fought bravely, gave everything they had to the great crusade that their fathers led them into. Whatever crimes their Primarchs committed, whatever failures brought down the judgment upon them, the warriors who bore their gene seed were blameless. And yet they were punished anyway, not with death perhaps, but with the erosion of who they were. Their identities were taken from them, their memories were stolen, their very sense of who they were was erased and replaced with lies so complete that they could never know the truth. They became ghost soldiers, survivors of the lost legions, warriors whose true origins were hidden even from themselves. They fought on, generation after generation, their gene seed harvested and implanted into new recruits, who inherited not only the genetic gifts of their Primarchs, but also the great lie that concealed those Primarchs' identities. For 10 millennia, the blood of the lost has flowed through chapters that do not know they carry it, through warriors who cannot imagine that their heritage is anything other than what they have been told. Somewhere in the Imperium, even now, there may be Space Marines who carry the gene seed of the 2nd Primarch in their bodies, the quiet contemplative, the master of the 2nd, the one who was forgotten. Somewhere, Warriors may bear the genetic legacy of the 11th, the latecomer, the unfulfilled promise, the brother whose very name was dangerous enough to choke the War Master. They will never know it. They cannot know it. The mercy that Malkador extended to their ancestors was the mercy of ignorance, and it has persisted across 100 centuries of war and sacrifice. The Primarchs were guilty, the warriors were not, and the warriors paid for their fathers' sins anyway, in the only currency that the Imperium would accept: the complete and utter destruction of everything they had once been. The recording device had grown warm beneath his fingers, its red light still glowing steadily in the darkness of the station. Vorsh did not know how long he had been speaking. Hours, perhaps longer. The cold recaf sat untouched beside him, and his throat ached with a rawness that came from words too long held silent, finally given voice. Through the window, Morithus Prime had completed nearly half its rotation since he began. The grey sphere turned slowly beneath him, patient as it had been for millennia, keeping its silent watch over the billions who slept beneath its surface. The dead did not judge. The dead simply waited and listened. Vorsh leaned back in his chair. He had done it. He had spoken aloud what the Imperium had decreed must never be spoken. He had given voice to the forgotten and the purged, to the empty plinths and the brothers who once stood upon them, to the tragedies that had preceded the greater tragedy and the warnings that no one had been permitted to heed. It was not a complete account. How could it be when the forgetting had been so thorough? There were gaps in his reconstruction, silences within the silence, places where even 3 years of obsessive searching had failed to uncover. He did not know the names of the Lost Primarchs. He did not know with certainty the precise nature of their crimes or failures. He knew only the shape of the absence they had left behind, the wound in Imperial history that had never been allowed to heal, because it had never been acknowledged at all. But perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the shape of an absence could tell its own story, if someone was willing to trace its edges with patient fingers and a heart open to grief. The station groaned softly around him, metal settling into metal, power systems cycling through their endless struggle against entropy. Somewhere below, a servitor continued its mindless rounds, maintaining systems for inhabitants who would never return. The air tasted of recycled staleness and old paper, and the faint ozone of cogitators that had been running too long and too hot. Vorsh reached out and pressed the rune that would end the recording. The red light flickered once and went dark, and in its absence the silence of the station seemed to deepen. He sat for a long moment in that silence, simply breathing. The Inquisition would find him eventually. He had always known this, had made his peace with it in those first desperate weeks of flight. But the recording would survive. He had made arrangements, redundancies, copies hidden in places that even he could no longer precisely recall. The truth would outlive him, scattered across the Imperium like seeds thrown to the wind, waiting for other seekers to find and nurture, and perhaps one day bring to flower. Outside his window, the stars burned cold and eternal. The same stars that had watched the Great Crusade unfold, that had witnessed the scattering of the Primarchs, and their reunion with a father who loved them, that had seen 2 of those beloved sons fall. The galaxy was very old, and it had kept many secrets across the long ages of its turning. Vorsh rose slowly from his chair and walked to the viewport. Morithos Prime filled his vision, grey and silent, a world given over entirely to the honouring of the dead. Billions of graves, billions of names carved in stone, preserved against the erosion of time because someone, somewhere, had decided that those lives mattered enough to remember. The Lost Primarchs had no graves. They had no stones, no monuments, no names carved anywhere in all the vast Imperium. They had only absence, empty plinths and blank banners, and the silence that surrounded them like a shroud. But now, perhaps they had something more. Now they had a voice, however small, speaking their story into the darkness. Now they had a record, however incomplete, of what had been taken from us when they were taken from history. Now they had at least one soul in all the galaxy who had chosen to remember them, even knowing the cost of such remembrance,